This is Kalaallit Nunaat, or Greenland. It's the largest island on the planet, an ice-covered giant in the Arctic, home to 56,000 people. These are the U.S. Virgin Islands, a far smaller tropical archipelago in the Caribbean, home to nearly twice as many people. At first glance, there would appear to be little in common between these two. They speak different languages, have entirely different climates, and are home to different people with different histories and cultures. But visit both, as I have, and you'll notice interesting similarities. Both feel in a sense forgotten, overlooked. From the buildings in the Virgin Islands yet to be rebuilt from a hurricane nearly 7 years prior, to a terrible mental health crisis in Greenland, or economies dependent entirely on the ups and downs of a single industry, fishing in Greenland and tourism in the Virgin Islands. Both operate on the fringes of their respective countries, thought not of as integral regions of a state, but dependent territories. The Virgin Islands, a former Danish colony, is now an American territory, and if the Trump administration is to be believed, they intend for Greenland to follow the same path. This unexpected resurgent conversation about American imperialism raises the fact that many Americans know far too little about their millions of fellow countrymen who live under territorial status, caught in a strange limbo between statehood and independence, part of a country that often acts as if they are not their responsibility. Unable to vote for or send representatives to the federal government that administers them, in some cases not even granted American citizenship, nor protected by the U.S. Constitution, territories, a status reminiscent in some ways of modern-day colonies, exist across the globe. There are roughly 40, mostly islands, administered by a dozen-some countries that often exist far away, have different languages and cultures, and are typically far wealthier and more powerful. This is America, but so is this, and this. Today, I'll briefly take you through the 5 permanently inhabited U.S. territories, each of which will get its own dedicated episode in the U.S. Explained. But we'll also dive into the numerous places which were once territories of the United States and either gained independence, statehood, or found something in between. Hello and welcome to That Is Interesting. I'm your host, Carter. On the edges of the American Empire, these are the U.S. territories, those of the past and the present, and how the U.S. gained each of them. When the 13 rebel North American colonies won independence from Britain in the Revolutionary War, they were immediately faced with a dilemma. Not only had the 13 colonies secured their own independence as part of the new United States, but they, with the help of France and Spain, had also won control of a large chunk of British North America that hadn't been in rebellion, the sparsely populated upper country of Quebec, a land mostly used by Britain for fur trading that, apart from a few colonial forts and trading posts, was primarily home to native people. Sitting between the Ohio River, Mississippi River, and Great Lakes, it today makes up the bulk of the American Midwest. This huge portion of land was claimed by Virginia. This would have meant that a single state, then the country's most populous, would have controlled 40% of the country's land and potentially exercised incredible influence within the new country. But smaller states like Connecticut and Massachusetts, which were already hemmed in from westward expansion by other larger states like New York, which also claimed control of parts of this northwestern land, saw in this new American possession the potential for them to expand their own territory westward and lay their own claims to sections of the Old Northwest. To solve this dispute, Congress came up with a solution, laid out in a law called the Northwest Ordinance. Virginia and the other states would cede claims to own the region to the federal government, who would write laws and appoint a government for the land. They called this status a territory. Instead of existing states spreading westward, as more white settlers moved into the new Northwest Territory, it would be broken down into smaller territories. While states would have to consent to change their boundaries, territories did not have that right, and were often altered, split up, and combined by the federal government. When the territories had a sufficiently large population, usually 60,000 people, and their inhabitants wanted to, or the government thought them ready, they could, usually after drafting a constitution for approval, be granted statehood through an act of Congress signed by the president. This meant that the U.S. could have more states, that new states would be equal to existing ones, and that the status of territory existed as an in-between position for the federal government to draw borders for future states and establish government for their residents until they had a large enough population. The Northwest Territory would eventually become 6 new states: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. In most cases, these territories were in practice just claims on a map, controlled in reality by the land's Native American inhabitants, and it set another precedent, that the native inhabitants of these newly acquired territories, who could not vote and were not considered American citizens, would be killed or displaced, either by treaty or by warfare, to small reservations or pushed further west. To the south, Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia, which claimed remote frontier lands stretching all the way to the Mississippi River, would follow the model of the Northwest Territory, ceding or selling their claims to these lands to the federal government, and creating new territories that would eventually become the other states of the South. The United States had not only a concept that all their land should be part of a state and a model by which to add new states, but a taste for westward expansion and settlement. And as the U.S. began to act more and more like an empire, gaining control of western lands through the Louisiana Purchase and Mexican-American War, it would, for the most part, follow the precedents set by the Northwest Ordinance for turning these territories into states. Other than the 13 colonies, the formerly independent countries of Vermont and Texas, and Kentucky, West Virginia, and Maine, which were split off of other states, as well as California, which became a state directly after being won from Mexico, each of the 31 other U.S. states were territories beforehand. Most territories only had to wait a few years, or at least no more than a decade or two, to achieve statehood, but some took quite some time. One of these was Oklahoma. Though its immediate predecessor, the Oklahoma Territory, only had to wait 17 years for statehood, the eastern half of the state had to wait 73 years and deal with a failed statehood bid of its own. Oklahoma is one of the most recent parts of the country to become a state. It wasn't until 1907 that Oklahoma became a state, making it younger than the airplane. Kind of surprising considering it's in the middle of the country, not the far west, and most of its neighbors became states decades before it did. Unfortunately, as became the case with a number of territories to come, the race of the territory's residents was a sticking point. One of the darkest chapters in American history has been the federal government's treatment of the country's native people, and a particularly terrible episode in that story was the Indian Removal Act. Carried out by Presidents Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, it oversaw the forced removal of the Cherokee, Muskogee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations from their southern homelands to open their lands up to settlement, particularly the establishment of slave plantations. They were sent on a forced march westward, halfway across the continent, to a land west of the Ozarks. A large chunk of the western U.S., most land west of the Mississippi not settled by white settlers, was generally referred to as Indian Territory, though it at the time had no territorial government. Though supposedly set aside for native peoples who had lost control of their homelands, whenever white Americans found the land desirable for settlement, this was quickly forgotten, as was the case in the northern part of the territory, which became Nebraska and Kansas. The tribes there, originally from the northeastern U.S., then joined the 5 southern tribes in what remained of Indian Territory to the south, and in 1890, the western half of the region was split off and opened up to white settlers as the Oklahoma Territory. Though called Indian Territory, it was never actually given official territorial status, nor a territorial government, preventing its Native American inhabitants from having a viable pathway to statehood. They tried, nevertheless, drafting a constitution, approving it from the public via referendum, and sending delegates to Congress to petition for Indian Territory's admission as the state of Sequoia. Instead, Indian Territory and neighboring Oklahoma Territory were joined together and admitted as the state of Oklahoma. In 1856, Congress passed a seemingly strange law, the Guano Islands Act. Basically, it said that any American citizen could claim any island anywhere on the planet on behalf of the United States, so long as it met a few conditions. No one could be living there, no other country could already claim it, and it had to be covered with guano. That's right, bird droppings, which it turns out could be used to make fertilizer and gunpowder, and as such were very valuable. On small rocks and atolls in the ocean where seabirds nested, large built-up guano deposits had accumulated. The U.S., this act stated, would be willing to defend these islands with military force. The United States laid claim to over 100 different islands around the world, mostly in the Caribbean and Pacific, through the Guano Islands Act, its first foray into imperialism outside of the North American continent, but settled all but 10 of these claims with other countries. One of the islands was made a part of American Samoa. The other 9 were, along with Wake Island, which was claimed by the U.S. military, and Palmyra Atoll, a far-flung possession of Hawaii that was split off after the U.S. annexed the kingdom, designated as the U.S. Minor Outlying Islands. Though each considered its own territory, with no capacity to sustain a large permanent population, these tiny islands, mostly nesting grounds for birds, marked the first time the U.S. created territories without any expectation that they would ever become states. In the Caribbean are Bajo Nuevo and Serranía banks, which are only claimed by the U.S. They're effectively governed by Colombia, and Navassa Island, which Haiti claims but the U.S. controls. The rest are in the Pacific. Wake Island, claimed by the Marshall Islands, Midway Island, the only Hawaiian island that isn't part of the state of Hawaii, Johnston Atoll, Palmyra Atoll, Kingman Reef, and Howland Baker and Jarvis Islands. Though considered uninhabited territories, the U.S. has tried to populate them, sending Americans, mostly native Hawaiians, to Howland Baker and Jarvis in the 1930s to build and man weather stations and landing strips in what they called the American Equatorial Islands Colonization Project. During World War II, though, the U.S. was unable to protect the colonies, and their inhabitants were evacuated. Midway, Wake, Johnston, and Palmyra were heavily built up as military bases during World War II and the Cold War, and airfields for stopovers for trans-Pacific flights, and Midway and Wake were both the sites of important World War II battles. In the peak of military buildup in the islands, the 1970s, more than 1,000 people lived on Johnston and Wake Island, and over 2,000 on Midway. Today, they are mostly nature reserves, together home to only around 300 people, mostly scientists, researchers, and a few military personnel on Wake Island. The year was 1868. The Civil War was over. The Union had won, the once rebellious southern states were now in the process of readmission to the Union, and the U.S. confidently stretched from Atlantic to Pacific, and a transcontinental railroad connecting the heavily populated East Coast with the quickly growing West Coast was now underway. With that, William Henry Seward, Secretary of State to Abraham Lincoln and now his successor, Andrew Johnson, did something surprising. He negotiated the purchase of Alaska, Russia's enormous colony in the North American Arctic. Russia had colonized Alaska for its value in the fur trade, but generally had sent fairly few settlers there. Alaska was already home to a large indigenous population, including both Inuit peoples like the Inupiaq, related peoples like the Yupik and Aleut, and other tribes more closely related to the Native Americans of the lower 48. While the Russians enslaved many Aleut, many Russian men in this Arctic merchant colony intermarried with Alaska Native women, at times assimilating into Alaska Native society, at times creating a multilingual, multiracial culture known as Alaska Creole. Though Russian dialects have survived in a few scattered Alaska Creole towns, for the most part the main legacy of Russian colonialism would be the continued popularity of the Russian Orthodox Church in many Alaska Native communities. Russia, though, began to worry that Britain had its eyes on Alaska, and were aware that they were likely unable to defend their colony. Instead, they decided to make some money off of it and sell it to the United States. Seward negotiated a purchase price of $7.2 million, today what would be $129 million. When you consider that that's little over $226 per square mile, it's a pretty great deal. Seward envisioned an American empire. After negotiating the Alaska purchase, he began talks with Denmark to buy 3 of their territories. Greenland, the massive Arctic island northeast of Canada, the European island of Iceland, and the Caribbean sugar colony of the Danish West Indies. With the sale of Greenland and Iceland in particular, Seward hoped Britain would eventually feel pressured to negotiate a sale of Canada. Hardly all Americans, though, shared Seward's imperial vision for the U.S. Though many supported it, some criticized the Alaska Purchase, calling it Seward's folly, Seward's icebox, or perhaps the best one, Andrew Johnson's polar bear garden. The politics of the time, though, impacted Seward's other ambitions. Seward opposed the impeachment of controversial President Johnson the following year, and as such, the Senate voted down a treaty he had successfully negotiated with Denmark to purchase the Danish West Indies. With that, he ended talks which were in place to buy Greenland and Iceland. Americans would later flock to Alaska during a number of gold rushes, but it wasn't until oil was discovered that the territory's population would really take off, and politicians in Washington would overcome the partisan disagreements that had held up the addition of America's 49th state until 1959. It was 1898. War was underway in America's backyard. Spain had long been the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, but most of its American colonies had since broken free from its rule, and independent nations now stretched down most of North and South America. Spain had maintained their grasp on just two Caribbean islands, Cuba and Puerto Rico, and in Cuba, revolution was underway. Not far off the coast of Florida, some Americans began pushing for intervention on behalf of the Cuban rebels, but the country had until then held off. They sent a ship, the USS Maine, to keep an eye on the situation and guard American interests. When the Maine exploded and sank in Havana Harbor, killing 266 people, the cause unknown, Spain was blamed. Americans were furious, and President William McKinley declared war. The United States had been to war before, but most had been either within the country or with its immediate neighbors, Canada and Mexico. Now the U.S. was sending troops not only to Cuba, but to Puerto Rico and far-off Spanish colonies in Oceania and Asia, like Guam and the Philippines. Americans got into a war frenzy, and with conflict raging in the Pacific, the U.S. began to think about the possibility of having a military base of operations in the region for ships to refuel. The McKinley administration turned their eyes to Hawaii, a country that had been in turmoil for decades. The large island nation in the middle of the Pacific, home to the Hawaiian people, a Polynesian ethnic group, had been united under the Kingdom of Hawaii since the reign of King Kamehameha I, who had expanded his rule from the island of Hawaii across the entire archipelago. Later rulers reformed the kingdom into a constitutional monarchy and built diplomatic relationships with foreign nations like the United States and the European powers. With the country increasingly present on the world stage, it wasn't long before business interests, particularly Americans, began to pay attention to the kingdom. Foreign missionaries and whalers had already begun frequenting the islands, but it was a free trade agreement with the United States that was the beginning of the end for Hawaiian sovereignty. Wealthy white Americans moved to the islands, buying up land to build sugar and coffee plantations and selling the coveted products to the U.S., taking advantage of the trade deal between the countries. They brought low-wage workers to the islands to farm the plantations, predominantly from Japan, the Philippines, and China, and Asians soon surpassed native Hawaiians as the largest racial group in the islands. These American business leaders quickly became the most powerful forces in the kingdom, which became terribly clear when a number of white businessmen, calling themselves the Hawaiian League, forced King Kalakaua to sign a new constitution that shifted significant power to a cabinet dominated by the Hawaiian League, packed the legislature with Hawaiian League supporters, and removed voting rights from Asians and Native Hawaiians while opening it up to white people who weren't even citizens. Threatened by violence from the Honolulu Rifles, a militia who backed the Hawaiian League, it was dubbed the Bayonet Constitution. Kalakaua's successor, Queen Liliuokalani, attempted to reverse the Bayonet Constitution, but that would be the final straw. White business moguls led by Sanford Dole, a part of the Dole pineapple family, calling themselves the Committee of Safety, staged a coup and overthrew Liliuokalani, declaring a new Republic of Hawaii with Dole as president. Americans were divided on the move. the U.S. ambassador to Hawaii, John Stevens, actively supported the coup, and President Benjamin Harrison sent U.S. troops to the kingdom to ensure the overthrow was successful, signing a treaty with the new government, annexing it to the United States. Harrison, however, had lost re-election to Grover Cleveland, and the new president blocked the annexation before it could be ratified, launching an investigation of the coup and declaring that the overthrow of Liliuokalani had been illegal. Dole, however, refused to step down and waited out the Cleveland administration until the election of William McKinley, who quickly signed and passed an annexation treaty with Dole's government. Native Hawaiians led by Liliuokalani successfully led a mass petition against the treaty and convinced the Senate to vote it down, but the Spanish-American War would change the calculus. With the war underway in 1898, Congress ratified another annexation measure, which McKinley signed, turning Hawaii into a territory, with Dole as its territorial governor. It would spend decades as a territory, despite possessing a major movement for statehood and a population larger than a number of states. The same business interests that had overthrown the kingdom found it easiest to exploit the islands for low-wage labor and profit off of sugar exports to the mainland with the islands under territorial status, while many Asian and Native Hawaiians pushed to possess the same rights as other Americans through statehood. It was the Jim Crow era, and many American politicians, particularly in the South, openly opposed the admittance of a majority-minority state. It wouldn't be until it would be paired with the admittance of oil-rich Alaska that it would become the country's 50th state in 1959. The main Pacific prize in the Spanish-American War was the Philippines, the massive Asian archipelago controlled by Spain. But to take the islands, the U.S. determined that first they would need to seize a smaller Spanish colony in the Pacific, the island of Guam, the largest of the Mariana Islands, which controlled the entrance to the Philippine Sea. Within just 30 minutes of American ships landing on the island, Spain had turned it over to the U.S. in a bloodless surrender. The island, home to the Chamorro, the native people of the Marianas, as well as a substantial Filipino minority who came to work under both Spanish and American rule, became a territory in 1898, its control formalized with a treaty the following year, though it was a territory controlled by the U.S. Navy. Captured by Japan during World War II, after the war, the island's population successfully pushed for U.S. citizenship and establishment of a territorial government. Home to 153,000 people, it's the country's second most populous territory after the much larger Puerto Rico, and the only other territory with more than 100,000 residents. It remains a major strategic point for the U.S. military. During the Cold War, the U.S. adopted the island chain strategy, the establishment of military bases across a series of American-owned and allied islands in the Pacific, including Guam, in order to block off a theoretical naval attack by China or the Soviet Union. Today, a third of the island is owned by the U.S. military, and 14% of its population serves in the armed forces. Though the Spanish-American War broke out with U.S. support for the Cuban independence movement, the country also seized Spain's other remaining American colony, the Caribbean island of Puerto Rico, which sat, like Cuba, not far from the U.S. mainland. The west-blowing trade winds brought Spanish conquistadors departing from the Canary Islands first to the Caribbean, and Puerto Rico became one of the very first parts of the Western Hemisphere to endure European colonization. The island's strategic location and San Juan's excellent natural harbor made the island an essential military possession, guarding the gateway to their colonial possessions throughout the Caribbean, Central America, and Mexico. Like many colonial islands in the Caribbean, it developed a plantation economy powered by the production of sugarcane and coffee. Over the centuries, its population, descended from Spanish colonists, the indigenous Taino people, enslaved people from West Africa, and later immigrants from Spain, began to see themselves as a single Puerto Rican people and push for freedom from Spain. That came during the Spanish-American War, when American troops, fresh off of victory in Cuba, easily wrested control of Puerto Rico from Spain. Unlike Cuba, though, the U.S. did not grant the island independence. By then, Puerto Rico already had more than 1 million residents, a population larger than many states, and today its 3.29 million residents far surpassed the population of not just each of the 4 other U.S. territories and the District of Columbia, but 21 other states. If you live in any of these states, Puerto Rico has more residents than your home state. Primarily during the 1950s, Puerto Rican nationalists waged an at times violent campaign for independence from the U.S., which was met by a mass surveillance program of the island, American intelligence infiltrating networks of pro-independence activists and militants. In 1950, a series of coordinated insurrections across the island were defeated by the National Guard, which even launched 2 airstrikes against the towns of Jayuya and Utuado. Puerto Rican nationalists infamously attempted to assassinate President Harry Truman that same year, who was pushing for increased autonomy for the island, and 4 years later attacked the U.S. Capitol, shooting and wounding several members of Congress. In the decades after the defeat of the nationalist movement, the major push on the island has been towards statehood. It was highlighted by the ineffectiveness of disaster relief after 2017's Hurricane Maria, which knocked out power across the island for 6 months, with some Puerto Ricans not regaining electricity until nearly a year after the hurricane. All in all, nearly 3,000 people died in one of the U.S.'s deadliest ever natural disasters, many in the hurricane's aftermath. Additionally, the Jones Act, which severely restricts trade between U.S. territories and foreign countries, subjects Puerto Rico to economically detrimental trade limitations that U.S. states don't face, and has limited its ability to grow and succeed, while the fact that Puerto Rican residents can't vote in federal elections has put issues facing the island on the back burner. In my opinion, there is no good reason to oppose statehood for the island. Population is not an argument, considering it has more residents than nearly half the states in the country. Though some opponents point to its extremely high poverty rate, 43%, as a territory, the island and its challenges with poverty are still the responsibility of the United States. The only difference is that the country has forfeited the opportunity to give itself the tools to properly address the problem. The argument that as a Spanish-speaking island, Puerto Rico is too different from the rest of the country is also a moot point. The U.S. has no official language and already encompasses a vast array of cultures and peoples. Besides, many mainland Americans speak Spanish as a second language, while many Puerto Ricans, especially in San Juan, speak English as a second language. Besides, modern technology has made translation little more than a minor inconvenience. The major holdup appears to be political. The assumption that Puerto Rico would vote for Democrats in federal elections has pitted many Republican politicians against the measure. This is a tale as old as time. Many states have had their admissions fast-tracked or stalled for political purposes, but this too is a bold assumption. States constantly change how they vote, and Puerto Rican politics are aligned more on the issue of statehood than on any liberal-conservative axis. Besides, whichever party follows through on statehood would presumably win a lot of political goodwill from the island. It's the only modern territory that has experienced any remotely mainstream conversation around admission as a potential 51st state. Typically, it and the District of Columbia are seen as the most viable candidates for a new U.S. state. The Spanish-American War dramatically changed the world map, freeing Cuba from Spanish rule, adding Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States, and setting in motion the annexation of Hawaii. But there was one more major Spanish possession taken by the United States that is no longer a U.S. territory. In 1920, the most populous state in the U.S. was New York. Driven by a bustling, skyscraper-studded metropolis, the state had become the primary port of entry for a massive immigration wave from Europe and was the first U.S. state to ever surpass 10 million residents. But it was not the most populous part of the United States. In 1920, the Philippines, a U.S. territory, surpassed New York and every other state in population and would remain the country's most populous possession until its freedom in 1946. The archipelago was home to a diverse array of ethnic groups from across the islands, speaking a variety of different languages and practicing different faiths. Spain colonized the islands, named them after their king, Philip II, and spread Catholicism across much, though not all, of the archipelago. They turned the coastal town of Manila on the northern island of Luzon into an important port city. Spanish merchants would trade silver mined in Mexico for silks and other expensive goods produced in nearby China and Manila, shipping silver and the goods they purchased with it back and forth across the Pacific from the Mexican port city of Acapulco to Manila in huge ships known as Manila galleons. This trade turned Manila into one of the world's most important cities and brought Chinese merchants, as well as Spanish and Mexican colonists, to the city, which was governed as part of New Spain, based in Mexico City. Today, it's the sixth largest urban area in the world, with 24 million people in it and its suburbs. And the Tagalog, the people native to the part of Luzon Manila is located in, are the largest ethnic group in the islands, and the Tagalog language is the most widely spoken language in the country. A legacy of Spanish colonialism, many Filipinos today have some Chinese, Spanish, and indigenous American ancestry from Mexico. The Spanish language, though, never took hold as much more than a second language of the archipelago's elite, and it faded away after the end of Spanish rule. Today, very few Filipinos speak Spanish. These resource-rich islands that Spain had managed to hold long after much of their imperial reach had collapsed elsewhere were seen as a key prize for expansionist America. A strategic naval victory at the Battle of Manila Bay near the city of Cavite brought about the end of Spain's centuries-long reign and turned the islands into an American territory. A judge and future president named William Howard Taft named its first territorial governor. Filipino rebel forces under revolutionary leader Emilio Aguinaldo, believing the U.S., like in Cuba, were coming as liberators, had been instrumental in helping the United States force out the Spanish. They declared the Philippines independent and did not accept American control. While the Spanish-American War had been relatively brief, in the Philippines, American troops would wage war against their former allies, ushering in a period of conflict that would last in parts of the archipelago for 14 years. At times using brutal tactics to suppress the territory's independence movement. An often overlooked conflict, the Philippine-American War remains one of the darkest chapters of American history and ushered in a devastating famine and cholera epidemic that killed at least 200,000 Filipino civilians. By the end of the conflict, with U.S. victory, the government's policy shifted towards eventually supporting independence, but still maintained tight trade control of the islands. During the Great Depression, Americans in the mainland began to support independence as farmers began to view cheap agricultural products from the Philippines as competition to their own crops, and the U.S. implemented a transitional Commonwealth Filipino elected government. The day after their attack on Pearl Harbor, which drew the U.S. into World War II, Japan invaded the Philippines. In their terrible occupation, which never managed to seize full control of the archipelago, including the infamous Bataan Death March, anywhere from 500,000 to 1.5 million Filipinos were killed, as well as 23,000 American soldiers, perhaps the largest ever military defeat. In 1944, the tides turned and an Allied naval invasion forced out Japanese troops. After the war's end, on July 4, 1946, the United States finally recognized the independence of the Philippines, ending their long fight for sovereignty. Today, with 114 million people, the Philippines are the 12th most populous country on the planet. Of the country's 5 current inhabited territories, the one in the most unusual situation is American Samoa. They maintain their own immigration and travel requirements, and even Americans need to show a ticket out of the territory or proof that they're employed there to enter. American Samoans aren't even considered to be U.S. citizens, the only U.S. territory where this is the case. Instead, they are U.S. nationals. They have an easier process to attain citizenship than foreign nationals, but still do not automatically have citizenship, despite living in the United States. It's the only of the 5 inhabited territories that is technically unorganized. The U.S. has never passed an organic act enabling it to organize its own territorial government, but in practice, it has had its own popularly elected territorial government for decades. This different system, many American Samoans actually oppose citizenship, allows them to use a traditional Samoan system throughout political and social life that would be seen as unconstitutional under the American system. For example, chiefs in the islands determine land ownership, and you must be at least half ethnically Samoan to own land there. In the territorial legislature, House members are elected democratically, while senators are chosen by village councils of chiefs. The southernmost part of the U.S., these Polynesian islands, Tutuila, the Manua Islands, and some other uninhabited islands, are the smallest U.S. territory and the second smallest part of the U.S., barely larger than the District of Columbia by land area, as well as the least populous part of the country, home to just under 44,000 people. It's closely tied, both culturally and geographically, to the neighboring islands that make up the larger, more populous, independent country of Samoa, which American Samoans often call Western Samoa. These two Samoas, both the homeland of the Samoan people speaking the Samoan language, have been divided politically for over a century. Throughout the 1800s, as was the case in Hawaii, Western powers took an interest in the resources of the Polynesian kingdom, and whalers and missionaries began visiting the islands. The U.S. in particular was interested in exporting sugar from the islands and began developing relationships with leaders there. As the U.S. was becoming an expansive naval power, they wanted a place to refuel ships in the South Pacific, and in 1878 signed a treaty with Samoa, allowing them to construct a coaling station in Pongo Pongo, a town on the island of Tutuila that sat on an excellent enclosed natural harbor. At the same time, Britain and Germany were building their own ties with local Samoan leaders, hoping to gain influence. Eventually, it broke into an all-out conflict called the Second Samoan Civil War, with Germany on one side and Britain and the U.S. on the other, backing rival factions seeking to control the country. The brief war ended with the so-called Tripartite Convention. Germany, the U.S., and Britain agreed to partition Samoa into a German colony in the Western Islands and an American colony in the East. The island of Tutuila, home to the American coaling station at Pongo Pongo, as well as the smaller and less populous islands of Manua, were now under American control. They were administered directly by the U.S. Navy, calling it the United States Naval Station Tutuila, and the naval commandant serving as military governor. In 1911, to include Manua, the name was changed to American Samoa. During World War I, the neighboring colony of German Samoa was captured by New Zealand, who called the colony Western Samoa. Taken for use as a military base, action in the Pacific during the World Wars was mostly elsewhere, and the Navy transferred it over to the Department of the Interior. While Western Samoa successfully gained independence from New Zealand in 1962, eventually changing its name to just Samoa, American Samoa has remained under U.S. control, though local chiefs have resisted attempts to formally incorporate the territory due to fears that doing so would impact traditional governance of the islands. The Panama Canal has been all over the news lately, with President Trump's claims that the United States should take it back. Today, under Panamanian control, a strip of land stretching 5 miles in both directions from the canal, called the Panama Canal Zone, was for more than 70 years a U.S. territory. The two cities at either end of the canal, Panama City and Colon, remained part of Panama, though places directly along the canal that are today neighborhoods of Panama City were at the time part of the Canal Zone, such as Balboa, which served as the territorial capital. This American territory physically divided Panama in two, but its existence goes back to the creation of the canal and the country of Panama altogether. The Isthmus of Panama represents the thinnest section of the North American continent, but it was not always the obvious choice to construct a water route joining the Atlantic to the Pacific. Tall mountains and dense, often disease-filled rainforests made any construction a foreboding possibility. Powers eyeing a project in the region looked as well at other routes, such as the longer but flatter path through Nicaragua, taking advantage of the large Lake Nicaragua. France attempted and failed to build a canal through the Isthmus of Panama, but the United States picked up on the project instead. The Isthmus at the time was part of Colombia, and the Colombian government refused to allow the U.S. in. Some Panamanian nationalists, though, had been pushing for independence from Colombia. President Theodore Roosevelt, McKinley's successor, backed a rebellion by these nationalists, sending a U.S. naval vessel there to scare off any Colombian counteroffensive. The U.S. signed a treaty turning over the canal zone to their control, but instead of signing it with the new country, they did so with the company building the canal. Almost immediately, the presence of an American territory within Panama was unpopular with many Panamanians. The construction of the canal itself was a deadly enterprise. Thousands of construction workers died working in dangerous conditions. Though working for the United States, Most workers themselves were poor laborers from the West Indies. After the canal was up and running, the purpose of the canal zone's existence was mostly for the U.S. military to be able to defend the strategic passageway, and residents were typically members of the military stationed there, civilians doing the work of operating and running the canal, or service workers. It was populated mostly by American workers, and by and large, it could be difficult for Panamanians to enter the territory. Towns within the canal zone were built and designed in the style of typical American towns and suburbs, filled with American businesses, restaurants, and schools, most years home to around 50,000 people. Profits generated from the canal mostly went into the territory, and an economic divide between the canal zone and Panama itself could at times be pretty stark, able to be seen visibly on the streets dividing Panama City from Balboa. Eventually, the U.S. built a border wall separating the two towns. A protest against the canal zone turned violent in 1964, and a number of Panamanian protesters were killed. President Jimmy Carter signed a treaty with Panama's Omar Torrijos that would set in motion the eventual transfer of the canal to Panamanian hands. But the U.S. would maintain an interest in the country, invading Panama in 1989 to overthrow dictator Manuel Noriega. Most of the Zonians, as the territory's residents were known, moved back to the mainland U.S., and many have settled in Florida. The canal has fundamentally transformed the country, bringing wealth and also inequality to Panama, which has since expanded it significantly. Panama City's downtown is home to the tallest buildings in Central America and the largest skyline in North America besides New York, Chicago, and Toronto, while other parts of the country deal with high poverty. Some parts of the former canal zone are among the wealthiest neighborhoods of Panama City, but perhaps the most visible legacy is the fact that the zone's former borders can be seen from space. The Strip, which Panamanians were barred from settling in, consisted primarily of uninterrupted rainforest, and Panama has set most of it aside as a string of national parks and protected forests spanning the width of the entire country. In 1867, due to political differences with him, the U.S. Senate had voted down William Henry Seward's treaty for the U.S. to purchase the Danish West Indies, a small Caribbean colony of Denmark consisting of the islands of St. Croix, St. Thomas, and St. John, just east of Puerto Rico. 50 years later, Seward's ambition would be realized when the U.S. would follow through on a purchase from Denmark, renaming them the United States Virgin Islands. The three islands had changed hands countless times since Spanish raids had killed most of their indigenous population. Colonial powers like Spain, France, Britain, and the Netherlands constantly laid claim to, settled in, and raided the islands over the course of centuries, but throughout the 1600s and 1700s, they fell under the control of Denmark, who built a slave society revolving around sugar production. Sugar was grown and processed into rum and molasses by enslaved West Africans in the islands, and then shipped from there to Denmark. Though controlled by Denmark, the islands, an important trading center, were mostly inhabited by enslaved black people, as well as British and Dutch plantation owners and merchants, and an English-based Creole language called Calypso took root in the archipelago. After the abolition of slavery, spurred by an uprising on the island of St. Croix, the plantation system lost its profitability, and Denmark began looking to sell. Despite the failure of Seward's treaty, they'd find interest in 1917. With the opening of the Panama Canal 3 years prior, the Americans were looking for a coaling station in the Caribbean halfway between the canal and the eastern seaboard, and the port city of Charlotte-Amalie on St. Thomas was appealing. Under President Woodrow Wilson, the U.S. purchased the three islands and designated them a U.S. territory. Today, the English-speaking islands are the only state or territory where a majority of the residents are black, and the only part of the U.S. where cars drive on the left side of the road. They are culturally siblings of the neighboring British Virgin Islands, and many Virgin Islanders commute to or have family living in the other country. The most recently acquired U.S. territory, the Northern Mariana Islands, is all that remains of a much larger territory, one physically as large as the lower 48. That is, if you were to include water. By land area, it was smaller than Rhode Island. The territory spanned most, though not all, of Micronesia, one of the four main regions of Oceania, located in the northwestern part of the Pacific. Three main island chains, the Marshall, Caroline, and Mariana Islands, were part of this vast territory, and each were home to numerous culturally distinct ethnic groups speaking different languages, such as the Yapese, Pohnpeians, Palauans, Cochayans, and Chuukese in the Caroline Islands, the Marshallese in the Marshall Islands, and the Chamorro and the Marianas. These islands were fought and competed over by Germany and Spain, but Spain's loss in the Spanish-American War pushed them out of the Pacific and allowed Germany to swoop in and seize the rest, eventually adding it all to their vast Pacific colony of German New Guinea, and governed over from far away on the island of New Guinea. During World War I, Japan, a country with growing imperial ambitions, seized each of the island chains from Germany, and the League of Nations formalized their control after the war as the South Seas Mandate. Japan governed the islands from the city of Koror, part of the archipelago of Palau. Though considered a mandate to eventually be given independence, Imperial Japan treated it as a possession. During World War II, the United States waged war against Japan in the islands, and major battles were fought on Saipan and Tinian in the Marianas, as well as in Chuuk and Palau. With the war's end, they gained an interesting status, both a U.S. territory and a United Nations trusteeship. The idea of a UN trust territory would be that it was a territory that was eventually expected to become independent. Though the territory belonged to the U.S. and was administered by the U.S., the United Nations Trusteeship Council would supervise their decolonization. Spanning an enormous stretch of ocean with roughly 100,000 inhabitants, representing 7 different major ethnic groups with no shared language or common economy, it was difficult to govern, so the U.S. broke it down into 6 districts: Palau, Yap, Chuuk, Pohnpei, the Marshall Islands, and the Mariana Islands, represented by the 6 white stars on their blue flag, though it had a central government on Saipan in the Mariana Islands. Altogether, the trust territory was often just called Micronesia. In 1976, the District of the Mariana Islands held a referendum. Residents decided that they no longer wanted to be part of the UN trusteeship and instead become a regular U.S. territory. They were separated off as the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, joining the other Mariana, the also culturally Chamorro island of Guam, as a regular U.S. territory. With this, a new district in the Carolines, Cochai, was formed, keeping the territory at 6 districts, and with Saipan gone, the capital was moved to the town of Palakir on Pohnpei. Just 2 years later, in 1978, each district voted on independence as a new country called the Federated States of Micronesia. 4 of the districts in the Carolines, Cochai, Yap, Chuuk, and Pohnpei, approved, and a year later, the Federated States of Micronesia was born, keeping an adapted version of the flag with 4 stars and keeping each district as its own state with its own government. Of the 2 districts that didn't want to join the Federated States of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands became their own country that same year, and Palau in 1981, ending the trust territory of the Pacific. The U.S. had not initially wanted the territory to end in independence, at one point even considering making it part of Hawaii, which would have been a huge expansion of that state, but they came to an interesting in-between instead. A few years after independence, each of the 3 new countries signed a compact of free association with the U.S. They're the only 3 countries with this type of compact with the U.S. They aren't part of the U.S., they're independent countries, and the agreement will eventually expire, but through it, the U.S. provides these associated states with financial assistance and some social services in U.S. departments, like FEMA, the U.S. Postal Service, National Weather Service, and Federal Aviation Administration. Additionally, the U.S. is responsible for their defense, and in return, other militaries may not enter their waters without U.S. permission. Perhaps most interestingly, their citizens are not considered immigrants while within the United States. Though the U.S. can turn specific individuals away, those who are admitted have the right to live and work anywhere within the U.S. without a visa for as long as they choose, and are able to serve in the U.S. military and access social services, though many have faced obstacles doing so. A large Marshallese community has moved to Arkansas, for example, through the Compact of Free Association. Though many see free association as a promising alternative to territorial status for small countries who want both sovereignty and a close relationship with the U.S., it hasn't been a perfect system. Infrastructure is still bad in the 3 countries, and large-scale U.S. nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands at sites like Bikini Atoll carries a toxic legacy for locals. If you enjoyed learning about these fascinating places that are or once were each part of the United States, I recommend you check out my regional breakdown of the United States, my video on America's ancestry, my ongoing 56-part series on every state, territory, and federal district in the country, the U.S. Explained, or my series on other fascinating places around the world, The Nation Explained. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you learned something new. Subscribe for more content like this. I cover the countries, cities, people, and places of the world and beyond. These videos will leave you saying, "That is interesting."